Welcome to Counter-Apologetics.
Welcome to Counter-Apologetics. I'm your host, Emerson Green, and today we'll be discussing igtheism. I know not what you mean by God. I am without the idea of God. The word God is to me a sound conveying no clear or distinct affirmation. Charles Bradlaugh, 1877. An igtheist or agnostic or theological non-cognitivist is one who doesn't believe in God because they can't make any sense of the idea of God. Many of God's attributes are extremely vague, arguably to the point of being devoid of content. And when an attempt is made to specify what they mean, they often don't cohere. In order for one of God's attributes to be rational, it must be meaningful, internally consistent, and not contradict other attributes. That's not too much to ask, right? For simplicity's sake, I'll be using those terms I mentioned interchangeably: agnostic, igtheist, theological non-cognitivist, though some have made distinctions between them. It's always important to ask what one means when they apply the label agnostic, igtheist, or theological non-cognitivist, since there would not appear to be any widely recognized standard usage of the terms. As far as I can tell, igtheism and agnosticism are colloquial terms, and are not widely used in academia. I'm taking all three to refer to a family of positions that roughly hold God to be unintelligible. So if we're talking about theological non-cognitivism, let's first talk about non-cognitivism. If you think something is real, then you must also think it's meaningful and coherent. But if you think a concept is incoherent, meaningless, or otherwise unintelligible, then you're a non-cognitivist about that thing. If you're a moral non-cognitivist, for example, you think there are no moral facts. It's not that you think moral statements are false. You don't think moral statements even could be true or false. They're not truth apt. Take a less controversial example. We're all non-cognitivists about squares that are round. If I say there's a two-dimensional thing that really exists that is both a square and a circle, you would reject my claim as a square-circle non-cognitivist. A square circle is an incoherent concept. It only has two properties, and they contradict each other. You know what a square is, and you know what a circle is. They're mutually exclusive. But think about a unicorn. There's nothing incoherent about a unicorn. It's just a white horse with a horn sticking out of its head. Unicorns are perfectly coherent, they just happen to not be real. A square circle, on the other hand, can't be real. It isn't real because it's incoherent. There are many varieties of igtheism, but they all make the same basic claim that God, his attributes, and perhaps even theological language in general, is unintelligible. That's why it's called theological non-cognitivism. If you're an igtheist, you believe God is less like a unicorn and more like a square circle. Throughout, I'll be referring to two main ways in which one can be an igtheist. The example of the square circle illustrates the first way: meaningful properties that don't cohere. I'll reserve incoherent for cases where God's attributes, or component parts of his attributes, contradict each other. You know what a square is, you know what a circle is. It's your knowledge of these two that allows you to spot the contradiction. So, incoherent, for our purposes, refers to a case where meaningful attributes don't cohere. And if there's a contradiction, that object exists in no possible worlds. We ran through several contradictions last episode. On to the second way. I'll reserve meaningless for attributes that are simply without content. Quote, "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe." End quote. Jabberwocky is a nonsense poem written by Lewis Carroll. There are several nonsense words throughout the poem, like wabe. What's a wabe? I don't know, and it doesn't help to say it's where slithy toves gyre and gimble. Consider the sentence, "The number 7 melts at 5 degrees Celsius." That sentence has proper grammar, and each individual word is meaningful. But taken together, the sentence as a whole is meaningless. So we have these meaningful words, unlike Jabberwocky, but when these meaningful terms are put in a different context, they become meaningless. So for our purposes, incoherent means there's a contradiction. Meaningless means there's no content. And I will use unintelligible as a more general, umbrella term to refer to traits that are meaningless or incoherent. That's not how everyone uses those words, so it's important to be clear about how you're using words like meaningless and incoherent, as well as atheist, agnostic, and theological non-cognitivist. Is igtheism self-defeating? The philosopher Graham Oppy has come out forcefully against igtheism, arguing that it's a self-defeating position. Quote, "I think that it's impossible to take seriously the view that talk about gods is meaningless. Suppose you say, it is meaningless to say there are gods. Is what you say meaningful? It must be that in order for it is meaningless to say there are gods to be meaningful, there are gods is meaningful. But if there are gods is meaningful, then the proposition, it is meaningless to say there are gods, is false. So the claim that it is meaningless to say there are gods is self-defeating. If it is meaningful, then it is false. And if it isn't meaningful, then it can't be used to characterize your position." End quote. If Oppy's reasoning is sound, one could not be a non-cognitivist about anything, including objects that are clearly unintelligible. All non-cognitivism would be self-defeating, on Oppy's view. Just replace God with square circles, or the Wabe from Jabberwocky. On this view, Lewis Carroll himself would be unable to claim the meaningless word he created was actually meaningless. So clearly something is wrong here. In order to reject the existence of Wabes, or claim that Wabeists are mistaken, or even claim that Wabe is a meaningless term, we must concede that it is not meaningless. Oppy's charge that igtheism is self-defeating is subject to parody, and would lead to the absurd conclusion that one cannot be a non-cognitivist about anything, even things that are obviously meaningless or incoherent. Here's where I believe Oppy and many others go wrong. A proposition that contains a meaningless term is not necessarily a meaningless proposition, and the same goes for incoherence. It's not true that if God is meaningless, any proposition that contains the term God is also meaningless. I'm not sure if Oppy is using the word meaningless in the same way I'm using it. I think many conceptions of God are not just meaningless, but incoherent. And it's obviously false that a proposition containing an incoherent term is an unintelligible proposition. Square circles don't exist is an intelligible proposition, even though square circles are unintelligible. And the proposition is true. So there can be true propositions about things that are totally incoherent. Take moral non-cognitivism. A moral non-cognitivist believes that moral statements are not truth-apt. They can't be true or false. But a moral non-cognitivist implicitly accepts the proposition, moral statements are not truth-apt, as true. They take propositions about moral statements to be true or false, even though they're moral non-cognitivists. Why can't the same be true for atheists? Moral non-cognitivists can also make interesting contributions to moral philosophy as non-cognitivists, and I think the same can be true for atheists. Those properties that belong to God which can be ascribed some meaning seem to contradict other properties he has. They don't cohere. So when we're discussing God's attributes, we're often speaking in gibberish that has no meaning or content, and only appears to have some foggy meaning by provoking associations and feelings. And where there appears to be content to one of God's attributes, it's often in conflict with our observations, or in conflict with another one of his attributes, putting us back in square circle territory. And by God, I mean roughly the God of the Abrahamic monotheisms. I'm not talking about, for example, a pantheistic notion of God, which equates God and the universe. I'm not a pantheist, but I can't be a non-cognitivist about the pantheistic idea of God and claim to find it incoherent or lacking meaningful content. That's to say that not all notions of God are incoherent, but many conceptions of God are incoherent. Many of the more popular conceptions are incoherent. I don't say, as an igtheist, there are no coherent conceptions of God. That would be an indefensibly strong claim. I can say, however, that there are many conceptions of God, including many of the more popular ones, that are incoherent. If there are intelligible conceptions of the Christian God, I haven't heard them, or I haven't recognized them as intelligible if I have heard them. All the versions of God that were ever live options for me would appear to be unintelligible. Some of the intelligible definitions of God I've heard are so far removed from what I regard as godlike that I wouldn't consider those beings gods if they existed. For example, if we were in a simulation, I wouldn't regard the simulators to be gods. God doesn't just mean intelligent designer or really powerful. So I'm not saying that every conception of God is unintelligible, and I'm also not claiming that every single attribute of the Christian God is meaningless or incoherent. Intelligent designer is meaningful. Some have argued that to call oneself an igtheist, one must believe that all God talk is unintelligible, not just some of it. I think that's too stringent. If I think that a God can't exist because a few of his properties are inconsistent, then I think that should qualify me as an igtheist. Just because I think some of the Abrahamic God's properties are meaningful or coherent doesn't mean I think the Abrahamic God is meaningful or coherent. If I postulate the existence of a square circle that's blue and coarse to the touch, I think we can still be non-cognitivists about that square circle, even though blue and coarse are perfectly meaningful properties. So I don't think that an atheist needs to believe that literally all God talk is unintelligible to take on the label. As I said, intelligent designer is a perfectly meaningful description. So is really, really powerful. But a really, really powerful intelligent designer isn't sufficiently godlike in my book. Unless that designer is omnipotent, omniscient, and disembodied, I wouldn't consider that being a god. And I happen to think that an all-powerful, all-knowing, disembodied mind is incoherent. So now we have to take a moment to wade into everyone's favorite issue. Is atheism a lack of belief or a positive disbelief? It's a disbelief. But here's how igtheism fits into the negative-positive atheism dichotomy. As I've been trying to illustrate with my running examples of waves and square circles, there are two main ways to be an igtheist. The example of the square circle illustrates the first way, two meaningful properties that don't cohere, and the wave example is meaningless. It's simply without content. So if God's attributes don't cohere, that's the stronger form of igtheism, and I don't think it's distinct from atheism. It translates to positive atheism, disbelief in God. If the claim is merely that God's attributes are meaningless, that's the weaker form. It translates to negative, lack of belief atheism, or lacktheism. I think we can take the labels of positive and negative atheism and apply them to igtheism just as well. Negative and positive igtheism. Negative igtheism being the view that God is meaningless, positive igtheism being what I perceive to be the more widely subscribed igtheist view, that God is incoherent. I seem to be in the minority here, but I don't think one must be a cognitivist about God to be an atheist. I think this means the tension between the igtheist and the atheist is imaginary. One says there is no God, and the other says there is no God. It's true that one believes God is coherent and the other doesn't. One is a cognitivist and the other is a non-cognitivist. But I think it's wrong to say that one must be a cognitivist to be an atheist, which seems to be the conventional wisdom. The usual reason for distinguishing atheists from igtheists is that atheists must be cognitivists about God in order for statements about God to be true or false. But it can't be true that any proposition containing an unintelligible term is unintelligible. The proposition square circles don't exist is true. They don't exist, and that's because they're incoherent. With meaningless things, negative igtheism, it's less clear. Here's a principle I'm proposing. Meaningless things do not exist. Maybe we shouldn't accept it, but it seems plausible enough. If I ask you the metaphysical question, does God exist? there are only two direct answers, yes or no. Responding to the question with, God is a meaningless term, is not a direct answer to the question. But if we accept the principle, meaningless things do not exist, then we've answered no to the question, does God exist? So whether the atheist thinks God is meaningless or incoherent, I think atheism should be considered a part of atheism, rather than distinct from atheism. Maybe you could reject my principle, that meaningless things don't exist, but I don't think anyone would deny that it has a prima facie plausibility to it. Incoherence, on the other hand, seems fairly open and shut to me. If a given notion of God is incoherent, that particular version of God exists in no possible worlds. With meaninglessness, it seems less clear.
Supposing I said to you, I'm going to ask you a question. Supposing I said to everybody who's listening, so I want a one-word answer here, if you can. What's the difference between a duck? Now, the problem with that is, though, although that is phrased as a question, it is not a proper question. There's something wrong. Right? Grammatically, it is a question, but it's not actually a question. When you examine the semantics, there's no there. This is just meaningless. This is a meaningless string of words that has the outward grammatical form of a question, but it is in fact doesn't express any proposition at all. Has no propositional content. There's no way to answer that properly, right? Consequently, if I said, well, so listen, the one answer that you could give to that is lemons, okay? And I'm stealing this example from Alex Malpass, actually. Thank you, Alex, for this. Supposing I said, what's the difference between a duck? And someone said, lemons, okay? Oh, okay, so you're a lemonist on the question of what's the difference between a duck. Now, supposing you said, I don't even understand that answer. That doesn't make sense. The question doesn't make sense. The answer can't make sense. Oh, so you're a non-lemonist. And you go, what? No, I'm not a non-lemonist either. That doesn't make sense.
Get confusing pretty quickly, right?
Right. So this is how a theological non-cognitivist views the entire discourse of faith. It sounds like you are making statements about reality. It sounds like you're making that these are supposed to represent some state of affairs about reality. But in fact, when you examine God claims, right, everything falls apart. It either resolves into a pile of contradictions or meaningless gibberish. Okay.
So let's bring the Wabe example into the real world. Imagine there's a camp of deeply committed Wabists and a reaction of a-Wabists. One group says there is a Wabe, the other says there is no Wabe. If you think Wabe is a meaningless term, you're clearly more on one side of the Wabist-a-Wabist dichotomy. They aren't equally silly positions, even if we say Wabe is without content. The theist says, there is a God, I worship him and he's my best friend. The atheist says, there's no good evidence for God's existence. God probably doesn't exist. The igtheist says, well, it seems like both of you are skirting over a slightly more fundamental issue, namely that no one knows what it is we're even talking about, but I'm basically in agreement with the atheist. God probably doesn't exist. So to recap, an atheist who claims God is incoherent is an atheist. An atheist who claims God is meaningless is at least a negative atheist, or a lacktheist. But it's unclear to me if we can say more than that definitively. I'm more interested in atheism motivated by the incoherence of God, since it leads us to positive atheism, disbelief in God. Most atheists appear to subscribe to the incoherent variety of atheism, positive atheism, which I think is unambiguously a strain of atheism. But here's one potential difference between the atheist and the atheist. One thinks it's at least possible there's a God, the atheist, while the other thinks it's impossible because God is incoherent. But this distinction doesn't hold up either. I don't say there can be no intelligible concept of God. Rather, I say I'm unaware of an intelligible definition of God. I admit there could be an intelligible definition of God, just as the atheist admits there could be a God, or the theist admits there may not be a God. I don't see why an atheist should be committed to saying, I am certain there are no intelligible conceptions of God, any more than an atheist should be committed to saying, I am certain there are no gods. I can only be a non-cognitivist about specific notions of God, and I admit that the family of gods I'm restricting my arguments to are the notions that were once live options for me. I'm excluding pantheism and deism, for example. And I also don't lie awake at night wondering if Thor is real, even though Thor is probably safer from a non-cognitivist argument than the God of the New Testament. in order to be considered a square circle non-cognitivist, I think one only needs to recognize the incoherence of a round square. If you add that the object is blue and has a radius of 10 inches, that shouldn't disqualify one from being a square circle non-cognitivist. And the reason this matters is because some have argued that theological non-cognitivists are basically disqualified from philosophy of religion. How can you be a part of the theological conversation if you think theological language is unintelligible? Again, an igtheist isn't one who claims that literally all God talk is meaningless or incoherent, just some of it. And I also don't think it'd be reasonable to say moral non-cognitivists should be disqualified from moral philosophy. In fact, they may have interesting contributions to offer, even for cognitivists. William Lane Craig has said of igtheism, quote, "Theists find that anti-theistic critiques of certain conceptions of God can actually be quite helpful in formulating a more adequate conception. Thus, far from undermining theism, the anti-theistic critiques of theism's coherence have served mainly to refine and strengthen theistic belief." End quote. So I want to come back to that take later, but consider some of the more outlandish charges that have been made against igtheist arguments. Igtheism is a conversation stopper. Igtheists can't be a part of any conversation in philosophy of religion. Igtheism is self-defeating, though other forms of non-cognitivism aren't for some reason. Igtheist arguments don't apply to every single conception of God, as if any atheist arguments apply to every single conception of God. My own hunch is that the association of igtheism and logical positivism bears some of the responsibility. Verificationism is widely considered to be discredited. Though the idea of igtheism is older than verificationism, there's a historical connection and a strong association in the minds of many. And I personally suspect that this association of igtheism and logical positivism has contributed to the generally dismissive attitude towards this genre of argument. So I want to take a minor detour to talk about logical positivism and its connection to igtheism. The humanist Rabbi Sherwin Wine coined the term ignosticism to describe his views about God. This is from the New York Times, 1965. Quote, "A Detroit rabbi who asserted several months ago that he did not understand the meaning of the term God has received both understanding and criticism. Rabbi Wine asserted that if religion is to be viable in the modern age, it must adapt its pursuit of the truth to the empirical method. He said that if we apply this criterion to the issue of the word God, we must then ask what empirical evidence exists to establish the truth of the statement, 'there is a God.' He then held that if there is no empirical evidence that could possibly establish either the truth or the falsity of the statement, then the statement is meaningless. He termed himself an agnostic, explaining that an agnostic is one who says that the statement, 'there is a God,' is meaningless by empirical criteria." End quote. By the way, the prefix ig means essentially the same thing as the prefix a. It just means not or without. It's the prefix in words like ignore, ignorance, ignoble. What Rabbi Wine seems to be alluding to is called the verifiability criterion of meaning, which was the central thesis of a group called the logical positivists. Under strict verificationism, only propositions that were empirically verifiable could be taken as meaningful. The logical positivist A.J. Ayer argued that since the concept of God was unverifiable, we can't speak of the probability of God's existence. God exists is a meaningless proposition. It's not even improbable. Though Rabbi Wine's agnosticism seems to have been informed by logical positivism, the case for God's unintelligibility does not rest on logical positivism, which is rejected by nearly all philosophers these days. Even Ayer, when he was asked later in his life what he saw to be the main defects of verificationism, answered that, quote, "nearly all of it was false," end quote. There were many attempts to modify the idea, but it's widely agreed that those attempts were unsuccessful. There are modern verificationists, but it's a controversial position to take. Philosopher Liam Bright is a logical positivist, and I've linked an interview with him on Embrace the Void if you're interested in hearing where verificationism is today. Verificationism would reject anything that couldn't be empirically confirmed or verified as meaningless. Many ideas in modern science were considered meaningless, at least on stricter forms of verificationism. Most logical positivists didn't even believe in atoms, though modern proponents like Bright do. Fortunately, to be igtheists, we don't have to defend the verifiability criterion of meaning, like Rabbi Wine apparently did. Being a non-cognitivist about God goes back farther than logical positivism. And though the school of thought inspired its fair share of non-cognitivism about God, it's not the only way to be a non-cognitivist about God. And I bring this up to inoculate you against a predictable objection to igtheism. Igtheism has some roots in positivism, but you're not implicitly endorsing logical positivism if you say God is meaningless. So if an apologist or someone else were to accuse you of irrationally adhering to an outmoded idea, they would be wrong. There's no reason to put yourself in the position of defending logical positivism in order to defend igtheism. Though if you happen to be a logical positivist, it's pretty easy to be an igtheist. You don't have to be a logical positivist to say there are no square circles.
You'll hear this more commonly. And this one is the one that I would associate with atheism. This is sort of the atheist sub-branch of non-cognitivism. And it's this. When you hear two people talking about God, okay, they end up talking about God, and one of them's a Jew, and one of them's a Muslim, and one of them's a Christian, and one of them's a Mormon, and they start talking, and then you realize, wait a minute, you think God is a triune deity? You think God is all good and all powerful? You don't think that. You think that God has a series of prophets, and Jesus was only one of the prophets, but he wasn't actually the same being as God, and so forth. And then you realize, wait a minute, you're all talking about God. But what you all really mean is the creator of the universe, whatever that means. And you might mean different things by creator, but the point is you're not talking about the same God. Obviously, you are all equivocating. So the atheist branch of non-cognitivism is that view that looks around and says, hey, wait a minute, something's wrong here. You people, you all think you're talking about the same thing, but you're not. You're just engaged in a massive equivocation. And because you're all using the same jargon, you think that you're all talking about the same thing, but you're not. Every one of you, even those of you in the same religion, every one of you is in a parish of one. You are all alone.
Some take atheism only to refer to the charge that all believers are in a parish of one. As I said, that's not how I'm opting to use the terms igtheist, agnostic, and theological non-cognitivist, but I think it's relevant to our discussion that no two Christians seem to believe in the same exact God. There is a massive equivocation on a religion-wide scale. It goes mostly unnoticed because they're using the same words: God, Jesus, holy, omnipotent, etc. And I suppose saying this massive equivocation goes unnoticed isn't exactly correct. There's endless splintering and factioning. There are tens of thousands of denominations of Christianity, many of them mutually exclusive. It's hardly an exaggeration to say that no two Christians believe in precisely the same religion or God. However, this equivocation may not be a problem for God's existence. My sister and I wouldn't give identical descriptions of our Father, but that doesn't suggest his non-existence. On the other hand, if these differences became great and utterly irreconcilable, it would suggest that he doesn't exist, or that we're not describing the same person. How are we supposed to believe that you're all talking about the same person, let alone all in contact with the same person, if none of you can agree on basic questions about what he thinks and what he wants? If my sister said, "Our father is extremely pro-LGBT, forbids the mention of Star Wars in his household, and regards Pinkerton as Weezer's greatest album," and I contradicted everything she said there, and asserted that in fact our father held none of those eminently reasonable positions, you would simply assume we were talking about different people, or that at least one of us was making a mistake. The massive theological disagreement that has been a part of Christianity from the very start is greater, and crucially, far more consequential. In fact, it's so much more consequential that it's perverse to draw analogies to other examples of massive disagreement. And it suggests to many atheists that religion is a merely human enterprise. I haven't made many arguments for positive atheism in the course of this show, besides the problem of evil, the argument from biblical confusion, and the problem of divine hiddenness. Most of the arguments have been counter-apologetics, tearing down reasons for God and explaining why we don't actually need God to explain anything. But are there any good reasons to positively disbelieve in God? The problems of evil, divine hiddenness, and biblical confusion are three arguments for positive atheism, not merely lacking a belief in God, but claiming that there is no God. And this would be another argument for positive atheism. But unlike the others, this would be an a priori argument, an argument that makes use of reason alone, prior to any observation of the world. I've been sympathetic to igtheism for the entirety of this podcast. I mentioned it back in the first bonus episode, my deconversion story, and I've bothered to make arguments that assume the intelligibility of God out of caution. I need something to fall back on if it turns out that it's just me who can't imagine an intelligible Christian God. So for the last 70-something episodes, I've just been rolling with the extremely vague notion of God that's mostly taken for granted. Of course, this family of non-cognitivist arguments would only pertain to God as we specifically define God, and unfortunately I don't think I can say that my definitions of God are the only acceptable ones. A theist could simply reject my definition of omnipotence, for example. The onus is on them to provide a new one that doesn't have more problems. Maybe I just can't think of a good definition of God. That doesn't mean there isn't one, but it doesn't change the fact that God, as we've defined him, could not possibly exist. Pointing out that an argument doesn't apply to all possible definitions of God seems to me like an admission of defeat. That's true of any argument about God, whether it's for or against him. No argument applies to all conceivable definitions of God. So why should this be a reason to dismiss non-cognitivist arguments? The criticism of theological non-cognitivism I mentioned, maybe you just can't think of a good definition of God, is a criticism of all non-cognitivism. Maybe you just can't understand the meaning of what we're talking about, could be leveled at anyone who asserts the incoherence or meaninglessness of anything. It doesn't really engage the criticism being leveled. Moreover, it appeals to a radical skepticism that could be used to justify the existence of square circles or meaningless, contentless ideas. Maybe you just don't understand how colorless green ideas could sleep furiously. Let's take a step back for a moment. Why should it be this hard to define God? Why should it be so difficult to explain a being who created our minds and supposedly wants a personal relationship with us? Am I really supposed to believe that a theistic God who wants to be in relationship with me created my cognitive capacities for understanding such that they have a hard time understanding God? Am I allowed to ask why he felt the need to do this? I think theism, by its very nature, gives us reason to expect that it should be easy to understand that God is definitely not incoherent. Theism, by its very nature, gives us reason to expect that it shouldn't be this hard to be a theist. On Christianity, it would be surprising to find ourselves in a world where a serious question can be raised regarding God's intelligibility. I doubt that, on Christianity, it should be possible for someone to honestly contend that God is an unintelligible concept. You'd think that God, if he wanted a relationship with us, wouldn't create our minds in such a way that it would be so difficult to even describe what God is. God could have created our minds such that it would simply never occur to anyone to question whether he's an unintelligible concept. He could have created our minds such that we would never be bothered by the problem of evil. After all, if you're a Christian, you presumably believe that the problem of evil is only an apparent problem. God could have created our minds in such a way that we would immediately understand why evil is not really a problem. God made the universe intelligible to us. Why didn't he make the universe morally intelligible? Why didn't he make himself intelligible to us? So here's one way of making an argument from atheism. I consider this to be a sort of non-cognitivist divine hiddenness argument. God is hidden from my mind in a very fundamental way. I can't even make any sense of the idea of God. 1. If the Christian God exists, it would not be possible to, in good faith, doubt the very intelligibility of the Christian God. 2. We can, in good faith, doubt the intelligibility of the Christian God. 3. Therefore, the Christian God does not exist. Obviously, a Christian could reject that first premise, that it wouldn't be possible for an honest person to question the very intelligibility of the Christian God. Perhaps God has morally sufficient reasons for creating our minds such that we can honestly contend that God is an unintelligible concept. But I would really like to know why. Why on earth didn't God just wire our brains a little differently so that it wouldn't be possible to have a genuine conflict over whether or not he's a square circle or a slithy tove? He created us. It was his choice to make us this way and not the way I'm describing. You're really underestimating God if you think he couldn't have wired us in such a way that it would simply never occur to us to wonder if he was an intelligible idea. It doesn't occur to me to question the meaningfulness of a very long list of things. Why didn't God just put himself on that list? Again, am I allowed to ask why God felt the need to create minds that hallucinate a problem that's not really a problem, and one that may result in eternal conscious torment? All I'm assuming here is that God is the sort of entity that, if he exists, would provide adequate evidence that he exists. Not doing so would seem strange for a God who wants a personal relationship with me and wants me to know him and wants me to evade hell. Hiding is irrational enough, but designing our minds in such a way that it's difficult to imagine what it is we're even supposed to believe in? The Christian story doesn't make any sense. What are God's morally sufficient reasons for designing our minds so that the concept of God seems incoherent? What makes you so sure there are such reasons? It's obviously not what we would expect. That much I hope we can agree on. But what could his reasons possibly be for doing so, for making himself unintelligible to us? Many have argued that if God existed, his existence would be obvious. There would be no such thing as a problem of divine hiddenness. I also believe that if God existed, it would be obvious. Theism by its very nature suggests that to me. All the more, I think if God existed, his coherence would also be obvious. At what point do you stop apologizing for God's irrational behavior and abandon this failed hypothesis? To quote Christopher Hitchens, to believe in a God is in one way to express a willingness to believe in anything. How do we come to find out what God's attributes are? God's attributes are mere stipulations. We don't discover his attributes. Whatever bizarre definition of mercy, or justice, or omnipotence, or omniscience, or freedom, or holiness that a believer conjures up to avoid problems, the exact nature of these properties is simply declared to be true. They are not discoveries. They certainly can't be demonstrated to be true. They're described in a book, sometimes a holy book, sometimes not, or they're inferred from the book. Furthermore, the believer assumes God is coherent, so when they're alerted to a contradiction, they just stipulate a new definition of some attribute. This process can go on indefinitely, and for some reason, the believer never fully abandons their original position. They just keep changing it ad hoc over and over again. It's important to note that our modern, convoluted definitions of God were not there at the beginning. Our earliest notions of gods were essentially just beings like us that were more powerful. They didn't start off as omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, spaceless, timeless, disembodied minds. They became that way over centuries. I think the vague notion of God was basically grandfathered in. God started off as something that was coherent, a being that was basically like us but more powerful, like a chimp might think of a human. But then our notions of God evolved over time, until we ended up with this bizarre, gasping Cronenberg monster of a concept that bears little resemblance to the gods of our ancestors. Over time, questions were asked, objections were raised, and qualities of God were altered and tacked on again and again over the centuries. And after a few thousand years of this, we've ended up where we are today, with a totally incoherent idea. William Lane Craig, noticing this process, has said, quote, "Theists find that anti-theistic critiques of certain conceptions of God can actually be quite helpful in formulating a more adequate conception." End quote. Theists will realize there's a problem and ad hoc reconfigure something about God's attributes. That goes on and on and on, and eventually they have a notion of God that's even less coherent than the one they started with. The Trinity is a perfect example of this process. The Trinity is a theological concept that wasn't there at the start. It was conceived over many generations to answer questions about the relationship of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. They kept eliminating answers, figuring out what the relationship couldn't be, what would be heretical to believe, until finally they got to the point where 3 is supposed to equal 1. Even the Catholic Church describes the Trinity as a, quote, mystery. The evolution of the Trinity is a fascinating subject, and it illustrates what likely happened many times over in many different communities regarding other questions on the nature of God. So I hope you won't mind if I play a 5-minute history of the Trinity. It's really interesting in its own right, and I promise it's worth the diversion.
If you read Matthew and Luke carefully, where you read about the virgin birth story, there is no hint that Jesus existed before the virgin birth. But as people thought about it more, they thought he must have been the Son of God from eternity past, and so they started developing a different view. A view which is not an exaltation view, not a view where a human becomes a divine being. They started developing a view of incarnation. An incarnation view is the view that Christ came into the world having existed before in the heavenly realm. This is not the view of Mark. It's not the view of Matthew or Luke. It is the view of the Gospel of John. Once Christians started thinking more widely that Jesus had been a pre-existent divine being, they started debating in what sense was he divine being? And if he was a divine being, how is he a human being? And so the debates continued. So a view called Docetism comes from a Greek word, dokeo, which means to seem or to appear. There were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd Christian centuries who said Christ was God and he only seemed to be a human. This view lost out because Christian theologians said if Christ wasn't human, he couldn't die for the sins of the world. Salvation requires that he not only be divine, but he also be human. And so this docetic view lost out. There were Christians who said, actually, Christ is both human and divine, but it's because of this. There was a man, Jesus, who was a very righteous man, who at some point in his life, say his baptism, was entered into by a divine being from heaven. I call this a separationist view because it separates between Jesus and the Christ. That was another view. That was declared a heresy because if Jesus isn't completely human, and if he isn't completely God at one and the same time, then you're not dealing with one person, you're dealing with two persons. But Jesus Christ is one person, not two persons. A more interesting view in some ways is a view that scholars have called modalism. It's called modalism because it says that God exists in 3 modes. Now, just like I myself, Bart Ehrman, just like I myself personally, I am at one and the same time, I am the son to my father, I'm the brother to my sister, and I'm the father to my children. I am a son, a brother, and a father. And God's like that. So this is a view called modalism because God exists in 3 modes of existence: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This view ended up losing out too, even though it was very popular a long time, and possibly people today still hold some view like this, but it ended up losing out. It ended up losing out because surely the Father and the Son are different from one another. When Jesus was on earth, he sometimes would pray to God the Father. He wasn't just talking to himself. This modalist view was popular in Rome especially, and was the view of the bishops of Rome, the people who would have later become the Pope. And eventually then it was turned back by people who held to a different view, the Trinity. It was in the context of arguing about modalism that one of the church fathers, a man named Tertullian, devised the term Trinity. The Trinity refers to the 3 persons who are separate persons, individual persons, who are all God. But he thought the Son and the Holy Spirit were inferior to God the Father because you can't have 2 things that are almighty. He thought that the Son was subordinate to God the Father. Eventually, this view was superseded by the view that there is a Trinity of 3 beings who are all God. They're equally God, and yet there's only one God. There's one God manifest in 3 persons. Well, but if you got 3 of them, there are 3 gods, right? No, there's only one. Okay, if there's one, then there's not 3, right? No, there are 3. The Trinity is a mystery. which means you cannot understand it, and if you think you understand it, you misunderstand it. This became the traditional view of Christianity. My point is, the early Christians did not think this. You will not find this doctrine in the New Testament. All four of these views, Docetism, separationism, modalism, and the Trinity, all four of those are logical outworkings of the view that Christ is God while God is God. It's just one of those views ended up becoming the Orthodox view.
My incoherentist approach assumes an ooh God, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omni this and omni that. If believers just claimed that God is really powerful and really knowledgeable without the ridiculous omni prefix, I don't think I could make much of an igtheist case. There's nothing incoherent about a being who's more knowledgeable and powerful than we are. In fact, there are some Jews who claim that the notion of an omni-God is a curse from the Greeks. Apparently, there's no Hebrew word for omnipotent, at least not one that appears in the Old Testament. A believer could wriggle out of igtheist arguments and many other paradoxes by simply rejecting the omni part of God's goodness, power, knowledge, and so on. Think of how much pointless theologizing could have been avoided if a childish superlative hadn't been tacked on to all of God's traits. It truly boggles the mind. There's no mention of omnipotence in the Old Testament, but these superlative traits are quite clearly present in the New Testament. Like I said, these arguments only pertain to certain conceptions of God. If you're not committed to accepting an ooh God, then I don't think I have much of a case. But if God's not omnipotent, we're still free to ask the question posed at the end of the Epicurean paradox: why call him God? There are two other ways I see that a theist could take to dodge igtheist arguments. The first way was explained by Richard Swinburne in his book The Incoherence of Theism. Inductively successful a posteriori arguments could indirectly show that God is an intelligible being. In other words, if the cosmological argument, teleological argument, and argument from miracles are sound, God's coherence would be implied. Though we can't think of an intelligible definition of God, if we have reason to believe God exists, we have indirect reason to believe that God is coherent. The problem is that it's not exactly agreed that arguments for God are sound. If we don't accept the argument from miracles, the teleological argument, the cosmological argument, and so on, we have no reason to resist taking igtheism at face value and believing that God is incoherent. There's still one easy way a Christian could successfully dodge an igtheist argument. The question is this: does divine omnipotence mean that God can do that which is logically impossible? Or are there logical limitations even for an omnipotent being? Most apologists and theologians today agree that God's omnipotence is constrained by logical possibility. God can't do logically contradictory things, and this doesn't mean that he's not omnipotent. But this has not always been a consensus view. Descartes, for example, was adamant that an omnipotent God would be able to do that which is logically impossible. God would be able to create a square circle. Some have argued that God, being the author of the world, is not subject to logic. He's able to transcend logic. Logic was created by God in the same way matter was created by God. This view could also be characterized as holding that there are no necessary truths. Alvin Plantinga has called this view universal possibilism. Though versions of it have been defended by Descartes and other philosophers and theologians, most would agree that there are necessary truths of logic and mathematics which are true in all possible worlds, and which God is not free to violate. God is subject to truths of mathematics and logic. Many Christians found and still find this position uncomfortable, since God's sovereignty seems threatened. God is forced to comply with something external to himself, just like the rest of us. Some Christians have been motivated to reject this view. In fact, any Christian could wriggle out of the paradox of the Trinity, igtheist arguments, by affirming the doctrine of created eternal verities, universal possibilism, or some other similar position. Contradiction? Who cares? Complaining about a logical contradiction in God's nature would be like complaining God's nature is in conflict with the mass of the electron, or some other physical state of affairs that appears contingent. On this view, laws of physics and laws of logic have the same status. They were both created by God and could have been different. God's omnipotence does mean that he can perform logically contradictory actions on this view, and even have a nature that's logically contradictory. Violating laws of logic would be no different from violating laws of physics. If God willed it, 2 plus 2 could have equaled 3. A could be not A at the same time and in the same way. So this view does lead to absurdities, but the whole point is that that doesn't matter. One problem is that this seems to undermine the entire project of natural theology. Nothing has to make sense, including God and nature. How could one possibly use reason to understand God through his creation? Biting that bullet seems worse than simply arguing that logical truths are necessary, and that this doesn't threaten God's sovereignty in any serious sense, which is what appears to be the consensus view these days. I've had an experience of God. That's why I know he's real, and why I won't be falling for any of your petty philosophical word games. Maybe I can't define God, but I've experienced God firsthand. This is similar to Swinburne's argument about the implied coherence of God, given the success of arguments in God's favor. If I've had a genuine experience of God, that indirectly implies his coherence. I've also heard the experience of God point made by apologist J.P. Moreland, and I'd say it's related to Calvin and Plantinga's sensus divinitatis. I'm not sure if these believers are saying God is an experience, or God caused them to have an experience. Either way, my response is the same. I don't doubt the reality of your experiences, but having the experience and having thoughts about your experience, for example claiming to know the cause of the experience, are separate. If I taste hot sauce, I'm able to predict what'll happen, but only subjectively. Personally, I couldn't give an objective, third-person description of what would happen that involves neuroscience, microbiology, and the chemical content of the hot sauce. I could only give a subjective description of what would happen. On the one hand, there's the kind of knowledge that comes with conscious experience, direct, immediate acquaintance with what it's like to have the experience. You know what it's like to taste hot sauce by tasting hot sauce. But just because you have the subjective experience doesn't magically grant you different kinds of knowledge that involve objective description. I want to make this distinction because I feel that believers often misunderstand my objection to their experiences of God. They seem to think I'm saying something like, that sauce wasn't hot, and they think I absolutely know with certainty what I experienced. God speaks to you, you feel the presence of the Holy Spirit, you spoke in tongues, you know you witnessed a miracle, you felt overwhelming love, or joy, or forgiveness, or the peace that passes understanding. I'm not in doubt of those things in the exact way many believers seem to think I would be. I'm not saying the hot sauce wasn't hot, but you can't smuggle in an explanation or interpretation of the empirical data and conflate it with the data. That's the crucial point. The experience and the interpretation of the experience are not the same thing. Those would be thoughts about your experience. What I'm saying is easy to grasp in the abstract, but in the real world, I know what I saw is often conflated with I know what caused what I saw, without the slightest thought. I know what I felt, and I know what caused what I felt is the crucial distinction I'm trying to make here. Your thoughts about the experience are distinct from the experience. So let's take the hot sauce example a little further. Imagine that as I tasted the hot sauce, you placed a curse on me that I would burn my tongue. Then you claim that this is evidence, if not proof, of your supernatural abilities. If that sounds ridiculous, just change hot sauce to modern medical treatment and curse with intercessory prayer. Countless times, the recovery of prayed-for patients who were simultaneously being treated by doctors is credited entirely to God. That's because the data is being conflated with an interpretation of the data. The patient recovered, therefore God caused the recovery. The child was diagnosed by a doctor with autism. Later on, they're not diagnosed with autism. God cured the child of autism. I know what I saw. And that one is a lot more common these days than you might think. Another explanation or interpretation would be that the child was misdiagnosed or prematurely diagnosed. They could have displayed some of the traits of autism at one point without actually having the condition and outgrew them as they developed. Maybe they still have the condition, but it's milder than originally supposed. All those seem like simpler and better explanations than a disembodied mind immaterially rearranged the matter in my child's brain so they would make better eye contact and pick up on social cues more effectively. The same goes for hearing God's voice, which I think is really just your voice, or God's presence during worship, which I think is reducible to music, lights, being in a crowd, or speaking in tongues, which I made a whole episode explaining. The point is that it's your interpretation of your experience that's in question here, not your experience. And though you shouldn't doubt the reality of your experience, you also shouldn't conflate your experience with any particular explanation. Those would be thoughts about your experience. I know what I experienced is not the same as I know all the causes of what happened. And really, this is pretty basic skepticism, and what I've been saying has applications far beyond religious experience. A believer might ask, if God is so obviously incoherent, why are there so many people who believe in God? I made an episode a while back, episode 22, about why I think people believe in gods. My one-sentence answer is that belief in God is an accidental byproduct of our hyperactive agent detection device that gives us a sense that there is agency where there really is none. And besides, I don't say that God is obviously incoherent. If it were obvious, then it wouldn't take 20 minutes to give the short pitch. I think God is alleged to have multiple attributes that are meaningless, internally incoherent, or logically incompatible with each other. But it's much more subtle than a square circle, which only has two traits that flatly contradict each other once you know the meaning of square and the meaning of circle. God can provoke associations and feelings which can lead to the impression that there's some kind of foggy meaning there. All-powerful, all-knowing, merciful, just. But every word in the sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, can also provoke associations and feelings. Yet the sentence taken as a whole is unintelligible. God's nature shouldn't seem more and more inscrutable upon further examination, right? Certainly not a God who wants us to know Him, and not a God who wants us to know Him and created our cognitive capacities for understanding. It's possible that a God who didn't care to have a personal relationship with me would be unintelligible to my mind, but not the Christian God. Is absence of evidence evidence of absence? In the case of a God who wants me to know about Him, yes. A God who desired a relationship with human beings would make Himself easily comprehensible to the human mind. Doing otherwise would provide a totally unnecessary obstacle to achieving His goal, to our mutual detriment. Though it's a bit more to my detriment than His. If things don't work out between God and I, He'll be sad that I'm not His friend, and I'll be existing in eternal conscious torment, at least according to billions of Christians who have existed. Even if the Christian doesn't affirm that view of hell, and instead affirms something like annihilationism, I'm still going to miss out on an eternity of bliss. So I'm pretty sure that I'm the one with a bit more to lose here. There are very good reasons to suppose that the Christian God is incoherent, and thus doesn't exist. Positive atheism, as in disbelief and not merely a lack of belief, is justified if it is the case that the concept of God is incoherent, and justified a priori. If igtheists are correct, that means we could have a set of a priori arguments for positive atheism. Many believers will be unable to provide a conception of their God that doesn't terminate in irresolvable problems. But those believers will rest in the assurance that someone can. This is what Dan Dennett calls doxastic labor, performed by religious authorities. This provides assurance to believers that the tenets of their religion are true, even though they don't really understand them, or even claim to understand them when pressed. We do the believing, the authorities do the understanding. That's the division of doxastic labor. And I can relate to this firsthand. When I was losing my faith, I believed that some wise apologist out there could handily answer all my objections. And it took a while to discover that this hypothetical apologist was a creation of my own mind that allowed me to cling to Christianity even after it stopped making sense. To quote Dennett, "We lay people do the believing, we sign on to the doxology, and defer the understanding of those dogmas to the experts." End quote. I wonder how many believers out there also can't make any sense of the idea of God or the Trinity, but believe that someone, somewhere, can make sense of those ideas. I started this series off with a quote from William James, from The Varieties of Religious Experience. Quote, "So we have the strange phenomenon, as Kant assures us, of a mind believing with all its strength in the real presence of a set of things of no one of which it can form any notion whatsoever." Of course, the retreat into transcendence will inevitably be made. You can't know God's nature. You're finite and He's infinite. If that's the case, and we can't know God, then we're not talking about a Christian God. It's completely impossible to know God, and He wants me to know Him. That's a contradiction. Besides, talk about having your cake and eating it too. God is knowable when things make sense, and unknowable when there's a contradiction. If you walk into a Bible study, or a church, or a seminary, they won't be shy about telling you all sorts of things about what God is and what He wants.
And of course, the real truth of the story is too great for us to understand, blah, 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 blah.
And that is where this always terminates.
Mm-hmm.
It always terminates in the idea, well, okay, say what you will, play your little logic games, try to capture Him by language, but no human being could possibly understand God. He does transcend our knowledge. But to me, if you're going to make the transcendence argument, if you're going to bail there and rest your ideas of God in this transcendent realm, be consistent. If God is unknowable, then shut your mouth.
Yeah.
And say God is unknowable.
Don't say that you can know Him when you win the lottery, but not know Him when He wipes out a
And
count.
why bother worshiping and dedicating your life to something that's completely unknowable?
You can't retreat into transcendence when you're called out on the floor and then make a non-transcendent, a very human-like deity the rest of the time.
That's all I have for you today. I have 2 new patrons to thank, Rick Pierre and Keegan J. Chalker. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Keegan. And of course, I'd like to thank my Hall of Fame patrons, Jesta, Phil Stillwell, Richard Crossan, Pre-Nifty, and Rory B. Murkowski. And you can support this show on a per-episode basis at patreon.com/counter, where you can get early access to every episode and access to bonus episodes. If you don't have the money to support on Patreon, but your colorless green ideas do sleep furiously, you can follow our social media on Facebook and Twitter, subscribe on YouTube, leave a 5-star review, or tell your friends about the podcast. You can also subscribe to and leave a review of our sister show, Walden Pod. Our theme music was written and performed by the band Whalers. The song is called Magic Tricks and was used with permission. Thank you for joining me today. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll talk to you next time.